The sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town of Dry Creek, baking the dirt road into dust. The sound of wagon wheels, horse snorts, and murmured conversations filled the air as townsfolk gathered near the saloon. They came not for a festival, not for church, but for something darker, an auction. A line of young women stood on the makeshift stage, their wrists loosely bound with rope. All were Chinese, brought from San Francisco under false promises of work or marriage only to be sold like livestock when they arrived. Their eyes were lowered, their dresses thin and travel-worn, their fear almost tangible. Among them was Leon, a small-framed girl no older than 20, her dark hair hanging limp down her shoulders. She clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, her only possession in this strange, cruel land. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp as the crack of a whip. "Healthy, young, and willing to work. Who'll start the bidding?" One by one the girls were sold off, some to ranchers needing help around their homes, others to men who saw them as something less than human. Coins clinked, hands raised, and the crowd's noise grew. Leon tried to keep her eyes on the ground, praying silently to be overlooked, or perhaps to disappear entirely. Her journey had already been filled with pain. She had left her village believing she'd earn money to send home, only to be betrayed and sold. Her trust was gone. Her hope nearly extinguished. As the line of girls dwindled, her heart sank. Every girl was taken except her. The auctioneer, a stout man with sweat dripping from his brow, looked annoyed. "No takers for this one?" he said, tugging at Leon's arm. "She's quiet, hard-working, speaks a little English." "A fine bargain," the crowd murmured. One man laughed. "She's too skinny," someone shouted. "She looks scared of her own shadow," another jeered. Leon's cheeks burned with shame. She wished the ground would swallow her whole. Her eyes darted toward the horizon. She had no one, no way to run. The auctioneer scowled, ready to wave her off. "No one? Then she goes back with the trader," a low, steady voice interrupted. "I'll take her." The crowd fell silent. Heads turned. Standing near the edge of the square was Elias Grant, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, wearing a dust-covered hat and a faded coat. His face was weathered from years under the sun, his eyes calm but tired. A widower, everyone knew his story, how his wife had died 2 winters ago, leaving him with an empty house and acres of land too quiet for comfort. The auctioneer squinted. "You, Mr. Grant? You want her?" Elias nodded once. "I'll pay fair." He stepped forward, handed over the coins, and cut the rope from Leon's wrists himself. His movements were gentle, deliberate. Leon stared up at him, her breath trembling. No man had ever touched her without cruelty since she'd been taken. Elias looked at her directly, his tone even. "You'll come with me. No one will hurt you under my roof." The words were simple, but they hit her like a miracle. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Elias guided her off the stage. Some whispered that the widower had lost his mind, taking in a foreign girl no one else wanted. But he didn't glance back. As the wagon rolled out of town, Leon sat beside him, hands clenched tightly in her lap. She dared not speak, unsure if this man was truly kind or just another master, yet something in his steady silence felt different. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a piece of property. And as the sun sank behind the hills, she allowed herself one fragile, dangerous thought. Maybe, just maybe, she had been chosen for something more than survival. The road leading out of Dry Creek wound through endless stretches of golden grass, the wind whispering across the plains like an old song. Elias Grant guided the wagon with steady hands, the leather reins creaking softly in his grip. Beside him, Leon sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. The silence between them felt heavy but not cruel, just uncertain, like 2 strangers caught in a moment neither had planned. Elias had not come to town to buy anyone. He had ridden in for nails, seed, and salt, supplies for the coming winter. But as he passed the crowd at the auction, something made him stop. He had seen the girls lined up, thin, trembling, their dignity stripped away. And then he saw her, the one they left for last. She didn't cry or beg like some of the others. She simply stood there, silent, her eyes dark with quiet endurance. Something in that expression, worn yet unbroken, pulled at something buried deep inside him. Since his wife Margaret's death 2 years ago, Elias had lived in a fog of grief. The ranch still ran, but his heart had gone cold. The house had grown quiet. The fire burned lower each night, and the laughter that once filled his life had vanished into memory. People in town whispered that he'd never recover, that he was a ghost walking in a man's skin. But when he saw that girl standing alone, dismissed and unwanted, a spark flickered to life. He didn't understand it, pity maybe, or recognition. She looked like someone who had lost everything just as he had. He couldn't explain it to himself, but he knew he couldn't ride away and leave her there. He cleared his throat softly as the wagon bounced over a rut. "You have a name?" he asked. Leanne hesitated. Her English was broken, but she understood enough. "Leon," she whispered. "Leon," he repeated, tasting the sound of it. "I'm Elias Grant. You'll be safe at my place." She nodded, though her shoulders were tense. Years of mistreatment had taught her that promises meant little. She wanted to believe him, but fear sat heavy in her chest. The last man who told her she'd be safe had sold her to strangers. They rode on in silence for a while. The sun began to sink, painting the horizon with copper and rose. Elias glanced at her now and then, how she sat upright, small hands folded neatly, her eyes scanning every shadow like a frightened bird. He sighed quietly. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. "I don't expect anything from you. Not work, not anything. Just help around the house if you want to." Leon looked up at him, startled. "No, work?" she asked, uncertain. "Not unless you choose to," Elias said simply. "You're not property here." The word property made her flinch, and he regretted saying it at once. He didn't push further. He'd learned the hard way that healing took silence more than speeches. As the sky deepened to twilight, they reached the fork in the road where a wooden sign read Grant Ranch. Smiles. Leanne's breath caught when she saw the land, rolling fields, a weathered barn and a small but sturdy house with smoke curling from its chimney. To her it looked like a world far removed from the cruelty of the auction yard. Elias helped her down from the wagon. "This is home," he said quietly. "It's not much, but it's honest." She stared at the cabin, unsure what to do. The last place someone had called home for her had been a lie. But there was something steady in his tone, something she wanted, needed to believe in. That night, Elias gave her the small guest room, laid out clean blankets, and left a lamp burning in the hallway so she wouldn't be afraid of the dark. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flame. No one had ever offered her safety before, not without wanting something in return. And as the wind whispered against the window, she touched the blanket with trembling fingers and thought, for the first time in years, that maybe tomorrow didn't have to be full of fear. The morning came softly, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. A pale mist hung over the fields as the sun crept over the hills. Leanne woke before dawn, startled for a moment by the stillness around her. The room was small but clean. Plain wooden walls, a single window, and a wool blanket that still held the faint smell of smoke and pine. She had not slept this peacefully in months. For a fleeting second, she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the auction came rushing back, and her chest tightened. Outside, she heard the slow creak of the barn door and the low murmur of a man's voice. Elias Grant, her new. What was he? Master? Husband? Savior? She didn't know. The words he had spoken yesterday replayed in her mind. "You're not property here." But such words were hard to believe after everything she'd endured. When she stepped outside, the morning air bit at her skin, but she stood still, watching him work. Elias moved with quiet efficiency, feeding the horses, checking the fence line, hauling hay as if it were part of him. He turned when he saw her, pausing just long enough to nod. "You can eat," he said gently, gesturing toward the kitchen. "There's bread on the table." She hesitated. In her past, speaking or moving without permission had brought punishment. Elias noticed the uncertainty and added, "You don't need to wait for me." His voice carried no sharpness, no impatience, just calm understanding. Leanne nodded quickly, her eyes lowering out of habit. Inside, she found the bread and a pot of coffee still warm on the stove. The table was rough but solid, the chairs mismatched. It wasn't grand, but it felt human. She ate quietly, every bite a reminder that she was no longer at the mercy of men shouting bids. When Elias came in later, brushing the dust off his coat, he sat across from her. The silence stretched between them like a wall neither knew how to climb. Finally, he said, "You can stay here as long as you like. I could use help keeping the place running. But if you want to leave one day, I won't stop you." Her eyes widened slightly. No one had ever offered her choice. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply bowed her head, whispering, "Thank you." He nodded once, seeming to understand that those two words held more weight than they appeared. That afternoon, Elias took her around the ranch, showing her the land. "It's not much," he said, pointing to the faded fences, the small creek that wound through the back pasture, and the wild horses grazing in the distance. "But it's home." Leon followed quietly, her step small but steady. She touched the tall grass with her fingertips, marveling at the openness around her. The horizon seemed endless, the sky impossibly wide. For the first time since arriving in America, she felt she could breathe. As they walked, Elias spoke a little more. He told her about how he'd built the house himself, how he used to work the land with his wife, Margaret. When he said her name, his voice softened, heavy with memory. Leanne glanced at him, sensing the ache beneath his quiet exterior. She knew what it was to lose everything. When they returned to the house, Elias asked if she wanted to rest. But Leanne, eager to be useful, insisted on helping. She gathered eggs from the coop and fetched water from the well, her movements graceful and careful. Elias watched her from the porch, noticing how she handled each task as if afraid to break something. That evening, when the sun slipped behind the hills and the first stars appeared, Elias lit the lamp and left it by her door. Leanne lay awake, listening to the sounds of the wind and the soft rustle of the prairie outside. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, from a crowded ship, to the cruelty of strangers, to this quiet man and his lonely ranch. For the first time, the silence around her did not feel like punishment. It felt like peace, fragile, new, and terrifyingly precious. And somewhere deep inside her heart, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. The days that followed passed in a quiet rhythm, slow, steady, and unlike anything Leon had known before. Life on the ranch moved with the sun. At dawn, Elias was already outside, tending to the horses, mending fences, and checking the water troughs. By the time he returned for breakfast, the smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the cabin. Leon, though shy and uncertain, had begun to move about the house as though she belonged there, sweeping the floors, airing the linens, and cooking simple meals from what little they had. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were careful, her accent soft. Elias never pressed her for conversation. He seemed to understand that silence was her shield. Still, he noticed things. The way she flinched whenever boots sounded too close behind her. The way her eyes darted toward the door when someone knocked, as if bracing for a blow. Each small sign tightened something in his chest. The first few nights she barely ate, sitting across from him at the table, her posture rigid. When he asked if she wanted more stew, she would shake her head quickly, murmuring, "No, thank you, sir." The word sir made him wince. "You don't need to call me that," he said one evening, his tone gentle. "Elias will do." She froze, unsure if he was testing her. Slowly she nodded. "Elias." Hearing his name spoken in her soft, hesitant voice did something to him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was something deeper, quieter, a warmth creeping back into a heart that had grown cold. As the days grew shorter and autumn began to whisper through the plains, Leon settled into a routine. She mended Elias's torn shirts with careful stitches, gathered herbs from the garden, and made tea the way her mother had taught her back in China. Elias found himself lingering near the kitchen door just to watch her move, her hands small but sure, her hair catching the light like black silk. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would stand by the window, staring at the open land beyond the ranch. There was longing in her gaze, perhaps for home or for freedom. He didn't know. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the lantern flickered low, Elias found her sitting by the hearth, sewing. He sat across from her, rubbing his tired hands. "You don't have to do all that tonight," he said softly. Leanne shook her head. "I like work," she said in her careful English. "It helps. Keep the mind quiet," he nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." Their eyes met for a moment. In that shared silence, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding of loss, of loneliness, of two broken lives slowly finding rhythm beside each other. As weeks went by, she began to hum softly while she worked, a tune that reminded Elias of gentle rain and faraway places. The sound filled the small cabin with life. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his chest tightening with something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Peace. Still, at night, when he walked past her door, he sometimes heard her whispering in her sleep. Words in a language he couldn't understand, pleas perhaps, or apologies. He would pause, his hand hovering near the door, wanting to comfort her but unsure if she'd welcome it. So he would return to his own empty bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long it would take for her to believe she was truly safe. One cold morning, he found her outside trying to haul a heavy bucket of water from the well. "You'll hurt yourself," he warned, stepping in to take it from her. She froze, half expecting anger, but his tone was light. "Let me," he said, lifting it easily. "Thank you," she whispered, her cheeks flushed. Elias smiled faintly. "You're welcome, Leon." It was a small exchange, a few simple words, but it shifted something inside both of them. The fear in her eyes began to soften. The silence between them began to feel less like distance, and more like peace. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both sensed that this quiet house, once haunted by grief, was beginning, little by little, to feel like home. The wind came hard that week, carrying with it the smell of rain and the restless cry of the prairie. Elias could feel the storm coming long before the first cloud appeared. He spent the morning checking the fences, tightening ropes, and making sure the animals were sheltered. Leanne followed him at a distance, her dress whipping in the wind, her eyes worried. By late afternoon, thunder rolled over the hills. The sky turned gray and the air grew heavy. Elias urged her to stay inside, but she shook her head. "I help," she said firmly, her voice barely rising above the wind. He wanted to protest, but there was a quiet determination in her face he couldn't bring himself to deny. So together they worked, securing the barn doors, driving the horses inside, covering feed barrels with tarps. When the rain finally came, it was fierce, lashing against the earth like a living thing. Elias thought they were done, but then he saw her sprinting across the yard toward the chicken coop, her hair plastered to her face. "Leon!" he shouted, running after her. She slipped in the mud, nearly falling, but kept going, her arms shielding a handful of terrified hens. By the time he caught up, she was shivering, soaked to the bone. He grabbed her arm, not in anger, but fear. "You could have been struck by lightning," he said, his voice breaking louder than he intended. She froze instantly, trembling, her eyes wide in panic. For a moment, Elias saw the years of cruelty etched into her face. She expected punishment. He realized it too late. He softened his tone, releasing her gently. Hey, I didn't mean to frighten you," he said quietly. "You did good, Leon. You saved them." The rain dripped from his hat as he guided her back toward the house, careful not to touch her again. Inside, the fire glowed faintly in the hearth. He fetched a blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. She sat by the fire, her small hands gripping the fabric like a lifeline. "Why you not angry?" she asked after a long silence, her voice fragile. Elias crouched beside her. "Because you did nothing wrong." Her lips parted slightly as if she didn't believe him. No man had ever spoken to her like that. Without demand, without threat. Her heart pounded. The warmth of the fire mingled with something new and unfamiliar. Trust. For a while they sat without speaking, the storm howling outside. Then Elias rose and poured her a cup of tea. "Drink," he said softly. "You'll feel better." Leon took it with both hands, her fingers brushing his briefly. A shock of warmth ran through her, quick, confusing, and impossible to hide. She looked away, cheeks flushed, unsure what to make of the tenderness in his eyes. He returned to his chair, watching the fire. "When the storm's done," he said after a while, "you'll see how green everything looks. The land always breathes easier after the rain." She glanced at him, puzzled by his calmness. "You talk like land is alive," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "It is. You just have to listen." Leon thought about his words long after he'd gone to check the windows. Maybe that was why she'd begun to feel different here, because for the first time in so long she wasn't treated as a burden or a tool. She was allowed to exist. That night when Elias passed by her door, he heard her humming again. The same soft tune from her homeland, lilting and sweet. He stopped to listen, letting the sound sink deep into the quiet house. The storm outside raged on, but within those walls, something fragile and precious had begun to grow. The barrier between them, fear, silence, grief, had cracked, just enough for light to slip through. And as Elias stood in the dim hallway, listening to her song, He realized that for the first time in 2 years, his house no longer felt haunted. It felt alive. By spring, the ranch began to bloom again. The grass grew tall, the horses filled out, and the fields looked alive under the wide blue sky. For the first time since Margaret's death, Elias found himself waking each morning with a quiet purpose. Leon was part of that. Her soft humming in the kitchen, her careful hands tending the garden, the way she smiled shyly when he complimented her cooking. Life had settled into something steady, until the world outside their ranch reminded them how fragile peace could be. One Saturday, Elias needed supplies. Leon, eager to help, asked to come along. It would be her first time returning to town since the auction. He hesitated. He knew what people said behind closed doors, but when he saw the determination in her eyes, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Stay close." The wagon ride was quiet, the road long and dusty. As they neared Dry Creek, Leon's heart pounded. The memory of the auction still haunted her. The laughter, the jeers, the humiliation. She gripped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, trying to disappear beneath it. When they arrived, heads turned. Conversations hushed. The shopkeeper's wife paused mid-step, her eyes narrowing. A group of men near the saloon whispered and snickered. "Didn't think the widower'd stoop to that," one man muttered. "Guess he needed a woman so bad he bought one," another said with a sneer. Elias's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He took Leon's hand, gently but firmly, and led her toward the general store. She kept her gaze low, praying no one would speak to her. But when they entered, the shopkeeper, Mr. Harlan, looked up and frowned. "What can I get you, Grant?" Harlan asked stiffly. His eyes flicked toward Leon, then back to Elias. "Didn't know you were keeping company like that." Elias ignored the jab. "Flour, salt, coffee, and kerosene," he said evenly. Harlan hesitated. "She's not supposed to be here, you know. Town council doesn't take kindly to—" Elias's voice cut through, low and steady. "You'll take kindly to whoever's with me." The tension in the room was thick. Leon tugged lightly at Elias's sleeve, whispering, "Please." "We go." Her voice trembled. She hated being the cause of trouble. He looked down at her, his expression softening. "It's all right," he said quietly. Then louder to Harlan, "You'll get my order ready or I'll take my business elsewhere." The shopkeeper muttered something under his breath but did as he was told. When the supplies were packed, Elias paid without another word. As they left, the whispers followed them out like a cold wind. Outside, Leon's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Why they hate me?" she asked softly. "I do nothing wrong." Elias's chest tightened. He hated that she had to ask that question. Hated that he had no gentle answer. "Some folks fear what they don't understand," he said. "And some folks just need someone to look down on to feel tall." Leon looked away, silent for a moment. You should not bring me," she said. "They make trouble for you." He stopped walking. "Leon," he said firmly, "I don't care what they think. You belong with me. Let them talk." The conviction in his tone startled her. She searched his face for mockery, but found only truth. Something inside her cracked open, a wall she hadn't realized she'd built. That night back at the ranch, she stood at the window, watching the lantern light sway in the barn. Elias was still out tending the horses. Her chest ached, not with shame this time, but with gratitude. No one had ever defended her before. When Elias came in, muddy and tired, she set a bowl of soup in front of him. "Thank you," she said quietly. He met her gaze and smiled, small but warm. "For what? For not letting them make me small?" He said nothing, but the look in his eyes said enough. The town's cruelty had tried to remind her of her place, but Elias's kindness had given her a new one. And for the first time, Leon felt something close to belonging. Spring melted slowly into summer, bringing long days and golden evenings. The ranch thrived under the rhythm that Elias and Leon had built together. They spoke little, but their silences had changed. They were no longer hollow. Now quiet meant comfort, safety. The house that once echoed with grief was full again, of small sounds, of life. Every morning Elias would find Leon in the garden, her bare feet pressing into the cool earth as she tended to the herbs and flowers she'd planted from seeds brought by a traveling merchant. She hummed softly while she worked, her voice carrying through the open windows of the house. Elias often paused mid-task just to listen. Sometimes she caught him watching and her cheeks would flush, but she didn't look away anymore. He would tip his hat, a silent greeting, and go back to his chores. Those small exchanges filled his days with a quiet joy he hadn't known since before Margaret's death. One evening, as the sky bled into soft pink and lavender, Leon brought him tea on the porch. The two sat side by side, watching the horizon. The warm air smelled of grass and smoke, and for a long time neither spoke. Then in a hesitant whisper she said, "I think maybe this land remember your wife." Elias looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. "Maybe it does," he said softly. "But it's learning new things too." She smiled faintly, lowering her gaze. "You miss her?" He nodded. "Every day. But the missing doesn't hurt like it used to." "Not anymore." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "You, good man, Elias, you give me safety when no one else did." He turned to her, the firelight flickering across his face. "You gave me something too," he said. "You reminded me what it means to live again." The words hung between them, tender and trembling. Leon felt her heart beat fast, unsure what to do with the warmth rising in her chest. She wasn't used to kindness, and yet here it was, real, steady, and growing. That night, a restless wind swept through the plains. Leon woke from a nightmare, her breath short and body shaking. The old memories, the auction, the cruel laughter, the feeling of being trapped, came rushing back like a storm. Without thinking, she stumbled from her room, tears streaking her face. Elias was already awake, sitting by the dying fire. When he saw her trembling in the doorway, he stood quickly. "Leon?" She couldn't speak. She only wrapped her arms around herself, whispering, "I was back there. They were calling." I couldn't move. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't touch her at first, only spoke softly. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you here. I promise." When she finally met his eyes, the sincerity there broke her. She let out a sob and for the first time allowed herself to collapse into his arms. He held her carefully, like something sacred, strong enough to steady her, gentle enough not to frighten her. They stayed that way for a long time, until her breathing slowed. She pulled back slightly, eyes glistening. "Why you so kind?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, and to find something worth holding on to again." For the first time, she didn't look away. Her hand trembled as she reached up and touched his cheek, a soft, fleeting gesture that said more than words ever could. From that night on, something changed. The fear that once lived in her eyes began to fade, replaced by quiet trust. They spent their days side by side, working the land, sharing meals, laughing softly at small things. Love didn't come suddenly. It grew slowly, like wildflowers after rain. But when it did, it took root deep, healing wounds neither had known how to mend. And as summer stretched wide across the plains, Elias and Leon found that what had begun as an act of mercy had become something far more powerful. 2 souls, once broken, learning how to be whole together. Autumn came to the prairie with golden winds and long, honey-colored afternoons. The fields around Elias's ranch swayed gently in the breeze, the harvest rich and full. Life had settled into a rhythm, steady, peaceful, and warm. The loneliness that had once haunted the ranch was gone, replaced by something deeper. Inside the small house, Leon moved with quiet grace, her laughter soft and rare, but genuine when it came. She'd learned to cook with the local herbs, blending her homeland's flavors with the rancher's plain fare. The men who worked nearby had started calling her Mrs. Waller, and though she always blushed, she never corrected them, Elias noticed. That morning, as sunlight spilled across the porch, he watched her hang fresh laundry on the line. Her hair gleamed like dark silk lifting in the wind. He leaned against the post, heart full of something both peaceful and aching. "Leon," he said softly. She turned, her hands stilling on the fabric. "Yes?" He walked closer, boots crunching lightly on the earth. "There's something I want to ask you." She tilted her head, curious. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. Simple, old, but polished until it shone. "I never meant for you to stay here out of duty," he said. "You've done more for me than I ever deserved. You brought life back into this house, and I can't imagine it without you." Her breath caught. He took her hand, rough palm against soft skin. "Leon, I don't want to just protect you. I want to walk beside you. Will you be my wife, not by name, not by debt, but by choice?" For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat tightened as tears filled her eyes. When she finally found her voice, it came as a whisper. "You choose me again?" He smiled, slow, gentle, full of quiet certainty. Always. Her tears spilled freely now, but they were happy ones. She nodded, pressing her forehead against his chest. Then I say yes. Elias held her close, his arms strong around her shoulders. The laundry fluttered above them, the prairie wind singing a soft hymn. They married under the same wide sky that had once held their sorrow. The ceremony was small. Just a few neighbors, some wildflowers Leon had gathered, and the old preacher from town. When he told Elias to kiss his bride, the rancher did so gently, reverently, as though afraid she might vanish if he held her too tightly. But she didn't vanish. She smiled against his lips, her hands trembling with joy. In the months that followed, their home grew fuller. Leanne filled it with color, embroidered cloths, painted jars, little touches of her homeland that mingled with Elias's sturdy Western ways. The neighbors who had once whispered began to greet her kindly, offering smiles instead of suspicion. Children came by for sweets she baked, and she laughed when they called her Auntie Leanne. And every evening, Elias came in from the fields to find her waiting by the door, lantern in hand, light spilling around her like a promise. One winter morning, she placed his hand gently over her belly, her eyes shy and radiant. A new life, she said softly. Our life. He couldn't speak. He only pulled her into his arms, overcome with gratitude, for the chance to love again, to build again, to begin again. When spring returned, their child was born, a baby girl with dark eyes and her mother's gentle hands. Elias often stood by the cradle, whispering prayers of thanks. He had lost so much once, but now, standing beside Leon and their daughter, he knew the truth of what the land had been teaching him all along. After every storm, the earth blooms again. And so did they.